Guys, it's Bree here at Blossom and Branch Farm, and today it's planting day. I'm going to give you all the tips and tricks that I have for getting things in the ground successfully and minimizing transplant shock while getting your soil healthier. Let's go. Even though it's not necessarily ideal planting conditions because we do have a lot of wind happening in spring, especially this time of year, you can see it's kicking up now. I'll give you some tips on how to mitigate that wind damage and how to prep the soil and how to have success with transplants. So it is right now, what is it? March. It's March 22nd right now, and that means we are officially spring. Typically this time of year we have snow on the ground. March and April tend to be our snowiest months, but it has been really dry and unfortunately a little bit scarily warm this year. There are lots of inconsistencies when it comes to spring plantings and things that we have to be really careful about because of course our temperatures are still very, very up and down. So just to kind of show you what's happening in the garden so you know relative maybe to your zone. Right now, for example, we have our first asparagus starting to come up out of the ground, which is a little bit early, I'd say, but yeah, they are popping up. And we also have our garlic has started to pop up and out of the ground. And also a lot of our native perennials have started to come up. So just for an idea of what's happening, the things that we are planting right now are all cold tolerant. So even though it's been warm, our soil temperatures are definitely above normal right now. It's still, again, we could still get a snap of cold, we could get snow. So we're still being mindful of all those things. So everything we're planting out right now, cold tolerant, frost tolerant, snow tolerant. That means that if we get snow, the snow actually forms an insulative barrier around the seedlings. So I don't worry about covering them. They're cold tolerant, frost tolerant, they'll be fine with snow. However, if we do get cold temperatures below maybe 20 degrees Fahrenheit and no snow, that's when I'll typically cover it. So something like burlap, I would throw over the top, or a cotton sheet. You could use frost fabric, but typically they're made with plastic, so we're trying to avoid those. So let's take a look at what we still have in the greenhouse, and then I'll show you also what we planted out already, talk you through how we're doing it. So here in the greenhouse right now, we've got our sweet peas that we actually just planted out a whole row of these. So these are kind of the leftover sweet peas. We've got our cabbage ready to go out, very cold tolerant. All of these are in soil blocks, of course. We've got our chamomile here. The chamomile is ready to go out. Chamomile very, very frost tolerant as well. We have some native things, so we've got some salvias here that need to be planted out. We have our leeks going here. Our lysianthus are about ready to go out, and yes, I do plant them out this small. They will be just fine. I'm gonna actually wait probably another 2 weeks on these just to let them get a little bit bigger, just because it's easier to see them when we're planting if they're a little bigger. And we have feverfew, which is very cold tolerant. Got our broccoli here. The broccoli is definitely ready to go out. So look how huge these are in the 1.5 inch blocks that make 5 blocks at a time. Broccoli looking really healthy. And we've got our onions going in here. So these are very easy to plant. We've got carnations and strawflower. I'm actually gonna wait 2 weeks to plant these guys out. They're not gonna go out quite yet. And then our kale is also ready to go. So we got a lot of this stuff in yesterday. Savannah, my farmhand, and I were here, and we got all of our stock in the ground. We got all of our snapdragons in the ground. And then we also planted our kale, cabbage, leeks, pansies, violets, sweet peas. So let's take a look at those. So I do right now have them under cover just because it was really windy yesterday. And this is something that I'll talk about as a tip for helping with transplant shock. But here we've got our sweet peas underneath some burlap. I'll need to get those trellised up here soon. And then again here, we have kale, and I actually underplanted with some violets and pansies. Okay, so first let's talk about how you know if you can plant out, because I think that's a big question that a lot of people have is when is it okay to plant out? So again, I mentioned we are about 7-8 weeks before our last frost here. Again, it varies by a week or two every year, but in general. So we are planting out only cold tolerant things, but I'm also checking soil temperatures. So for me, I journal a lot with my garden. I kind of keep tabs on from year to year what soil temperatures are looking like when I plant things out so that I know when things are successful or not. So I kind of have a sense at this point when to plant out. But if you don't, I would take the temperature of your soil. So what you want to do is you want to take a thermometer, pop it into the soil to the depth that you're going to be planting your seedling to. So that kind of depends on the size of the seedling, right? A smaller soil block is going to sit closer to the surface where the soil temperatures will be a little bit warmer, but deeper down into the soil, the temperatures will be probably a little bit cooler. So measure to where the depth of your seedling is going to be, and then take a look at the temperatures. Now, in general, for example, for things like peas, they can germinate at a pretty cold temperature, say around 35 degrees soil temperature. So that means they're also going to do okay if planted into a cooler soil. But something like a tomato that needs 65 to 70 degrees to germinate, that one's not going to do okay in a cold soil like this. So if you're not sure, keep an eye on those germination temperature averages. You can go to Johnny's Seeds. They usually have great culture lists and information on growing and germinating. So you can kind of look at the soil temperatures that are ideal for that plant. And then look at your 10-day forecast. So I always look at the 10-day and say, okay, is there going to be something extreme in the weather like a cold snap or a big snowstorm or wind, high winds? If there is, I try to avoid it if possible, but sometimes I can't. So for example, here in April, we are going on a gardening retreat in France, and I have to get stuff in the ground. So whether or not there's going to be a huge weather event, I'm just kind of having to plant it and hope for the best. So that being said, I do have a couple things that are going to help keep my seedlings protected in case anything comes up. We'll talk about that here in a minute. So, but first what we're going to do is we're going to prep the soil, and I'm going to grab my broad fork. I'm going to broad fork some of this, and then we're going to do a little bit of compost, not a lot, because again, my soil tends to be higher in phosphorus, and compost can really add to that. If we use too much compost, then it can really compound that phosphorus issue, which can then lead to things like nutrient deficiencies and things like iron and calcium. So anyway, so I'm not going to add a ton of compost, but if my garden needs a little organic matter, I'll add a little bit, and then also our alfalfa fertilizer. So I've posted this one before. I'm going to link the video below that has the alfalfa fertilizer recipe in it, so you can go and reference that if you want to use it. It's also in our regenerative gardening course, in our workbook that comes with the course. So broad forks, we're going to get a little bit of that alfalfa fertilizer added. And then we also have another thing that we're doing this year, which is called a soil primer. This is from a company called Advancing Eco Agriculture. And if you're familiar with John Kempf, big name in the regenerative agriculture world, he runs the Regenerative Agriculture podcast and also has a company that makes biological fertilizers. So this is an area where we're still trying to get our biological activity up and running, just because we started from a pretty poor soil here. So we're going to be using what's called a soil primer, and that is going to basically jumpstart the biological activity in our soil so that our seedlings are going to form the associations with the soil faster in terms of bacteria and fungi, so that we can get all those fungal associations going, and also that rhizophagy process that we talked about in past videos. So we're going to put that on too. All right, let's go. I've got my bed broad forked, which if you watched my last video on broad forking, we give more detail on how to do this the proper way. But what you really need to know is that the soil right now is not overly saturated. So I'm not compacting it, which is especially important with clay soil, that I'm not stepping on wet soil that could compact it. So it's a little dry, and that means that I do want to wet it before I transplant. I just find that I get a better transplant, less risk of transplant shock if I make sure that my soil is nice and moist before I even plant in, and then I'll come through and do a secondary water. So this is where I'm going to apply my soil primer. I'm going to wet the soil, and then I'm going to put that soil primer from Advancing Eco Ag on. Let's go take a look at how we're going to mix that up. Now again, this is not strictly necessary. So if you've been practicing, these regenerative things for a long time, if you've been doing several years of what we advise, which is low to no soil disturbance, no tillage, if you've been doing cover cropping, if you've been doing mulching over the winter, mulching the soil, keeping the soil temperatures even, keeping the roots in the soil, and then not using things like fungicides and not using synthetic fertilizers, then you probably don't have to do this, because if you're following all of those principles that we talk about in our regenerative gardening class, it's probably unnecessary. But for the first couple of years, while you're establishing those practices and doing that, getting that soil function, that soil food web function up and running is really helpful. And that's where biological fertilizers come in handy. So that's why I'm doing that in this space, because again, this was a space that we established by tillage. And I also didn't have a cover crop in this space over the last winter, just because I was a little behind on getting it in. So that's why I'm doing that this year, but not strictly necessary, guys. I'm not saying like you have to go out and buy this stuff. It's just a company that I really believe in and I trust. So these are the three components of the primer. So this one is called Rejuvenate. It has 1% nitrogen. It's got molasses in here, seaweed, and some other proprietary ingredients. So that's the Rejuvenate. And then we're also supposed to add the Sea Shield. And Sea Shield has fish hydrolysate, so like fish emulsion, and seafood protein hydrolysate. Again, this is going to go straight into the soil. We're going to mix it with a little water. And then we also have this product called Spectrum. This is a biological soil inoculant. So you guys know I always do inoculation at planting time, and I've shown how we use the slurry dip before. I'm going to show how we do that again here, but you could use a mycorrhiza, you could use azospirillum that we talked about in our inoculating video. You could use kind of a variety of things depending on what you're planting, depending on what the soil is like in the area. If you're not sure, go with something that has, you know, a mycorrhiza inoculant and also an azospirillum. And if you're doing a legume, use a rhizobia to either apply to your soil first or to add into your slurry. So I'm going to put this directly onto the soil as I'm wetting the soil, and then I'm going to go ahead and dip into a compost slurry. So I like to do that kind of compost dip when we're planting out. So let's mix this up. I'm just going to add it to some water here. So we're supposed to do equal parts of the Rejuvenate and the Sea Shield. This one smells good. The Rejuvenate smells like molasses. It's a really potent molasses smell. Now I'm just using a watering can to do this, but if you have one of those sprayers that you can adjust and dilute with, you could use that as well. Just gonna start with a little bit. So we want this, a little bit goes a long way of this stuff. Now this one smells, the Sea Shield. It's got that real fishy smell. Nice. And then it says it's supposed to be six ounces of Sea Shield, 6 ounces of Rejuvenate, and then 1 gram, I believe, of this. It's 50 grams per acre, and this is 50 grams. So this will cover an acre of growing space. So again, a little bit goes a long way. We're going to mix that all up with some water and apply it to the soil. The recommendation is to apply this when the temperatures are 50 degrees or above. It doesn't work very well if the temperatures are too cold, just because this is a living product. So the microbes need a certain temperature to survive. So we're going to make sure that your temps are warm enough. I'm going to apply this, and then I'm going to water it in. And you can see I'm doing it on a cloudy day. So this is something that is really helpful when you are doing transplanting, is that it's not too sunny. So if you can time it on an overcast day, that's going to be your best chance of success with not having transplant shock, because it's that direct sun. It's just a lot for the plants when they're dealing with transplant to have that direct sun. So again, if you can, shoot for an overcast day for transplanting. That's going to help with transplant shock. So it's also good for this biological activity here, so that we're adding this because UV rays can kill what's in this that we're adding here. So therefore, overcast is better. You could also do this at dusk the night before you're going to transplant. But yeah, ideally we're not applying this in direct UV light. All right, now I'm just gonna water that in with a hose. Now I'm gonna prep my compost slurry dip for planting. So I'm using my homemade compost. Homemade compost is always gonna be the best option for this because it's got my native microbes in the soil. So what I'm trying to do is get some of the good native microbes that have been growing in my compost pile and get my plants inoculated with those and get them into my new planting area as quickly as possible. So I'm gonna get a scoop of my compost. Now, if you don't have a compost pile, you could also grab some dirt from a healthy area of your garden that's already kind of has good healthy plants growing in it, or that you've been taking good care of or adding good compost to over the years. You could just take a little scoop of that and use that. All right, now ideally you could add a little molasses to this to help multiply the microbes. It's like a little food for them, and that'll help multiply them. And then you'd be applying it. You could also do this the night before if you're planning ahead, and if you're thinking in advance. Make your little compost dip, add some non-chlorinated water. So let some water sit out, exposed to air for about 36 hours. That'll take any chlorine out of your tap water, because chlorine could kill these guys. And then let it sit with some molasses overnight, and that'll help make this a little bit more powerful, but not the end of the world if you don't have time to do that. I'm just gonna add some dechlorinated water, and then I'm gonna dip my plants in this as we plant into the ground. Again, we're getting those microbes right up and on the roots of the plant. Now, if you want to go extra credit and you have some of this stuff around, because I've been talking about it, if you have some other biological inoculants around, so something like mycorrhiza, if you have a bag of that, that's another product you could get from Advancing Eco Ag, or you could use a company like Bigfoot Organics also has this as azospirillum. You also have mycorrhiza from them, so I'm just gonna add that to my dip. And you could make a big batch of this. I'm making a relatively small one because I'm not doing a huge planting today, but if you are doing a big planting, you know, make a 5-gallon bucket of this. That's totally fine, but you don't really want to make more than you're going to use that day. So I would not make a big batch of this and then let it sit. You want to use it immediately. Oh yeah, again, just don't panic if you're not exactly sure what to add. If you're not sure, the best bet I would say is to kind of do a wide array of different biologicals. So different bacteria, different mycorrhiza, kind of the wider net that you throw, the better. All right, another thing that I'm doing here to help minimize transplant shock has to do with the depth that I'm planting the seedlings. So I have drip irrigation lines here because we're in Colorado. Overhead irrigation in my zone is not only not very efficient, it also is pretty ecologically irresponsible just because it tends to all evaporate, and we're already usually in a drought here. So drip irrigation is the best option for us right now. I wish there was a non-plastic option, but I just haven't found one. But what I do is when I'm planting, and especially because we're gonna be kind of out of town, in and out, I don't know that I'm always gonna be able to be keeping a careful eye on these, is I'm slightly sinking the area around the seedling. So as I'm planting my seedling in, I'm both making sure it's right next to an emitter, and these are drip lines from Drip Depot. I'm putting the seedlings right next to the emitter so that I know that the water is gonna be going right there, and then I'm also sinking them a little bit. So that looks like this. So basically what I do is after I get my seedling in the ground, and you can see here's an emitter here and an emitter here, and I'm just gonna lightly press that soil down. So I'm making a little, kind of a little depression here around the seedling. So the water will run down into that depression and it'll go right up next to that seedling where I need it, instead of like running down the side of my mound here. So I'll kind of shape the soil around my seedlings to create that little depression just to help direct the water where I need it to go. The last thing I'm gonna do is give these guys a thorough watering, and I am not going to mulch. So let me tell you why, because you guys know I talk a lot about mulches. I have a whole video on all my favorite mulches, and I am going to come in and mulch these soon, but not right now, because this is a spring planting. So that means our soil temperatures are still on the colder side. If I go in and I put mulch on top of this, it's gonna do two things. One, it's gonna prevent the soil from warming up more, which I want it to warm up more. That's gonna help get these microbes active. It's gonna help stimulate the plant growth. So I still want the soil to continue to warm up. So I don't want to mulch it, because mulch is going to actually keep the soil temperatures a little bit cooler than I want. The other thing that can happen is that at night, the warmth that the soil has absorbed during the day from the sun is released up, and that can help prevent frost damage. So if we do get very cold nights, that mulch on top of the soil can prevent that heat coming up and protecting my seedlings. So I'm gonna leave these unmulched for now. I am going to come in and mulch them here probably in about a month, or once our soil temperatures start to warm and our temperatures warm up into the upper 70s, 80s, that's when I'll come in and I'll mulch these to help keep the roots cool. But for now, I'm gonna leave it unmulched. I'm gonna do a nice deep water in, and then if it's windy, I'm gonna show you what to do. Ideally, we have already hardened off our seedlings for at least a week to 10 days. So exposing them gradually to the conditions they're going to be subject to outside. So things like sun, wind, those kinds of things are really important to harden off for, and also cold temperatures. So specifically with these ones that we're planting out before our last frost, they need to kind of build up that little bit of like antifreeze that hangs out in their cells that helps protect them from frost. So every day I start about a week to 10 days in advance, and I start putting my seedlings outside for an hour at first, then 2 hours, then 3 hours, then 4 hours, exposing them to night temperatures slowly, and then that way once they're ready to hit the ground, they've been hardened off. But that being said, we can still sometimes hit spring days where all of a sudden it gets super duper windy, or I'm transplanting and it's overcast and then it gets really sunny. So it can be helpful to keep some burlap close by or on hand. This is the same burlap that I use to, cover up seeds when they're germinating to help keep moisture in. And all I'm gonna do is I'm gonna lightly drape it. Now, if it's windy, you're gonna wanna have some staples nearby to staple this down and into the ground. But all I'm doing is I'm just laying this over the top, and that's just gonna help specifically with wind, but also with extreme sun. So because the burlap doesn't block out all light, it still is letting some light through. So it's not going to, you know, create a situation where it's going to kill the seedlings, but it's just filtering it, and it's also, again, providing that little bit of protection from the wind. So if you want to leave this on for the first 3, maybe 2-3 days after transplanting, it's gonna help get them accustomed until their roots can start going out and helping to kind of provide them with that little bit of hardiness. This can be helpful, just keeping some burlap on hand and tossing it over the top. Again, if it's windy, make sure you staple it down on the corners. Those are my tips, guys, for healthier transplanting, better transplant with less transplant shock. Let me know your tips below. I want to hear all of them, and I'll see you guys around here next time at the farm. We're going to be doing some direct seeding, so make sure you stay tuned for that. See you guys around here next time.